Good afternoon to all of you, and warm regards from Finland. Just left this morning at 6:15. It wasn't raining like it was here yesterday, I heard. I hope you survived it. I must say this is a bit of a baffling, lovely event for me because it's the first time that I am present here at the auditorium. So this is basically the first time that we're really using the auditorium here. My name is Alexander Stubb. I'm the director of the School of Transnational Governance here in Florence. And I'm also very glad to see that Techno Conference has been put in their place, exactly where the monster of Florence was indicted quite a while back. Unfortunately, they're not listening to what I'm saying, so we're quite okay. I've been asked to say a couple of words on the school itself, and then I'll give you my 2 cents, if you allow me, on the war and its ramifications, because I look around and I see that we have people from all over the world. So I'll throw a little thesis at you as a tester before I then start asking very difficult journalistic questions to Kurt. Just a couple of words about us. With the School of Transnational Governance, when I started here 3 years and 2 days ago, we didn't have a location. We were up there on the hill. We were 30 people. We didn't have a master's program. We only had a few fellows and virtually no executive training. We are now 250 people. We're down here at Palazzo Buontalenti, which eventually will end up being 22,000 square meters renovated by the Italian state. You're seeing about 4,000 of it. We have 3 main pillars that we work with. One is a master's program. It's a master's in transnational governance. And I know it doesn't ooze of sex appeal, but at least, climate is a transnational issue. We have roughly 50 students a year, moving to a cruising speed about 100. It's a 2-year master's program, so that will, I think, by 2025, 2026, bring us 200 students at any given time. They're from all over the world. We do about 50% Europe, and 50% the rest of the world. We are kind of a wannabe Kennedy School of Government in Europe. In other words, we basically do public policy, but with a special twist. Our twist is such that we firmly believe in the combination of theory and practice. I myself started in the world of academia, moved to the civil service, worked as a diplomat, worked at the Commission, and then did a little bit of a stint in politics before I moved from the European Investment Bank over here to the School of Transnational Governance. We have a lot of people who have a practical grounding, like Jos, who is running our climate program. Secondly, we have a fellowship program which has 2 legs. One are global fellows. Any of you interested? Applications will be open again soon. You can come here and spend some time with us in the global leadership fellows, which are about 30 a year from roughly 1,000 applications. And that's a 5 to 10 month program. Secondly, we have an Africa Fellow program, which is thanks to the European Commission. We have, roughly speaking, 10,000 expressions of interest for 30 places in a 3-month program that takes place here in the fall. We also have senior visiting fellows, etc., etc. The third thing we do is executive education or executive training. And it hasn't been published yet, but in September 2024, we will begin with our first executive masters, global executive masters, GEM, for 20 to 30 students/professionals who will be not in resident, but will spend some time here with us as well. So very much a public policy school and on a fairly strong growth path. What you're witnessing here is basically the magic of Jos and his team. Many of you have been to the Climate Week before. You've seen what it's like, and YOS, of course, is part of one of our flagships, which is the EIB Climate Chair. We have others on the European Digital Media Observatory, which is basically fighting fake news, disinformation, and doing fact-checking and media literacy. We have programs on artificial intelligence and democracy and many others as well. Now, my second point before I start poking Kurt is just a couple of words on the war in Ukraine. I'm Finnish myself. I was the Prime Minister of Finland for a while and for 8 years in government. And of course, things Russian are very close to my heart. By the way, if you haven't seen, President Zelensky is visiting Helsinki today, meeting my president and Nordic prime ministers. It's his 4th visit outside the country since the war began. So what's my take on the war? Take number one is that we have witnessed the end of the post-Cold War era. Many of us believed in the early 1990s, together with Fukuyama, that we are witnessing the end of history, whereby most societies in the world, 200 nation states, will revert to some kind of a combination of liberal democracy, market economy, and globalization. It didn't happen. We could talk about a long slide towards an age of disorder, probably starting somewhere with 9/11, moving through the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, perhaps the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the questioning of capitalism, perhaps the war in Georgia, where I mediated peace myself as chairman of the OSCE and foreign minister of Finland, or perhaps the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, or perhaps the emergence of the others in a post-American world, or perhaps the asylum crisis in 2015, or perhaps Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as a demise of the Anglo-Saxon world, or perhaps COVID. But at the end of the day, I think that the war in Ukraine was pretty much the tipping point. Why do I say that? I say it because it was a blatant attack on international rules, norms, and laws. It was an attack on what we used to know as the liberal world order, the one that you and I, most of us, have grown up with for the past 30 years, a world whereby we believe that the territorial sovereignty and integrity of a nation state is safe, whereby you cannot walk into a country or drive into a country with tanks. It was also a game changer in the sense that it made the world to take sides. You had to be either for, against, or somewhere in between. And I think it's a general fallacy to think in the West that the whole world has reacted to this war emotionally and is strongly supporting Ukraine. It's not. Yes, 141 countries voted to condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly. 35 abstained and 4 voted in favor. 35 that abstained, they're over half the world's population. Only 40 countries in this world have sanctioned Russia. It's easy to condemn, but it's much tougher to sanction. Now, what's my thesis? My thesis is, well, it's something that I'm writing a book about. So, my thesis is that we have entered an age of disorder. In that disorder, we are going to witness a multiple system of orders and overlapping alliances. But there are 3 basic centers that will decide what's going to happen. I'm mentioning all of this, and I'll come to it in the end, because climate and energy is a big part of it. The 3 centers are the global West, which is the United States, Canada, Europe, and our allies, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. Roughly 50 out of the 200 nation states of the world. The other extreme is the global East, which is China, and to a lesser extent and with a different tack, Russia, Iran, and roughly 22 other states that have a tendency to vote with these countries in the UN. They are the two extremes. The global West wants to remain or retain the status quo. In other words, the liberal world order, its values, its norms, and its institutions. The global East does not want to maintain the liberal world order. Russia doesn't want to maintain any order except the order of power in its neighborhood. China would be okay with a norms and rules-based world order, which I think is good news for climate. But no one in the global East is very happy with the current multilateral institutions that guard those norms, whether it's the UN, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, or any given of the 800 international institutions that exist in this world. COP, of course, being one of them as well. Who is going to decide this world order between the global West and the global East? In my mind, it's going to be the global South. Global South, of course, is a very broad concept, sometimes contested, but let me explain. 125 states. In Asia, led by India, closely followed up in the region by, say, Indonesia. Middle East Gulf region, led by Saudi Arabia. Africa, led by South Africa and Nigeria, half of the economies of the African Union, 54 countries. And then, of course, Brazil leading Latin America. On the sanctions, 2 countries sanctioned Russia in Asia, 0 in Africa, and 0 in Latin America. I think it's wrong of the West to try to frame this into democracy versus autocracy. It is much more than that. The reason I believe that the global South is going to be the swinging pendulum deciding the direction in which the world is going to tilt is that they don't necessarily want to take sides at this stage. They're more interested in energy security, in food security, in climate, in inflation, and many other of the key global goods. Now, my thesis, and this is where I start poking Kurt, is to say that, of course, the world is driven by a combination of values and interests. And of course, in the next decade, when this order for the rest of the century will be built, we'll be looking at some kind of a combination of competition, conflict, and cooperation. I think there are a few key global goods where we simply cannot afford to compete, have conflict, but we need cooperation. And the global goods that I'm talking about are energy, climate, raw materials linked to technology, and technology itself. And my question to Kurt is to ask that if you look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, if you look at the energy transition in Europe, which, how would I say, was accelerated, to put it mildly, because of the war in Ukraine, if you look at climate in general, how do you see that the war in Ukraine has changed all of this, and what's your thinking in the Commission at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Before I answer your question, which is a very intriguing one, I want to take a few seconds to speak to the magic of this event. When I joined DG Klima in January, the first thing that colleagues fixed in my agenda was the Florence week, or the climate week. Being here now since yesterday, having listened to all these sessions and also enjoying the many conversations on the side, I understand why colleagues are so enthusiastic about this place and about this event. It's been already extremely informative, instructive, very rich in discussions. I think it's quite unique, actually, that you see this gathering of people from academia and think tanks, industry, governments, a few from the press as well. Hopefully they will respect the Chatham House rules, as was agreed yesterday, to discuss a quite arcane but so important subject of carbon pricing. It really gives you so much new perspectives. So I really would like to thank everyone and also the colleagues here in the School for Transnational Government for helping us to organize this and do it together with the Commission. So thanks for this. To your question, Alex, it is true that the dreadful events in Ukraine have accelerated our climate and energy agenda. The Economist made an assessment a few weeks ago in which they concluded that actually because of the Ukraine war and thanks also to policies like Repower EU, we have accelerated, fast-tracked the clean energy transition by 5 to 10 years. And this is consistent with what we have done since we launched the European Green Deal and that ambition in 2019. In 2019, I remember very well, we had this ambition of reducing CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 50% at least by 2030. And many told us, but Commission, Europe, why do you do this? You're on your own. Why are you hurting yourself so much in your competitiveness? Today, we're in a very different situation. Today, we're almost afraid that other countries in the world will overtake us. But what we have done very consistently since 2019 is use every crisis we had to double down on our climate ambition. We had the pandemic when a few leaders said, should we not pause a little bit this whole climate business? Should we not take care of the economy? We came out stronger, actually, with the Next Generation EU and the first ever collective borrowing at the EU level, of which I hope we will see also the results and the benefits in Italy. We then had the Ukraine crisis. Instead of protecting ourselves from the effects, we increased our targets for renewables, for energy efficiency. We rechanneled some funds from the Recovery and Resilience Fund to invest even more in the clean energy transition and the green business of the future. And the latest wake-up call, as you also mentioned it this morning, Jos, is the IRA, which I believe is very welcome for global climate policy. It's also a welcome wake-up call for ourselves, because we need to get our act together on industrial strategy. I believe that we are creating a massive market for clean tech and green goods in Europe. That market will be there because we have the legislation in place, but we will not be able to sustain our climate ambition if we are not supplying that market from within Europe as well. We need supplies from the rest of the world. We will be open to trade, but we also need to have our industry in Europe. So this is a critical decade, not only for the climate transition. We need to reduce emissions this decade. It's also a critical decade for Europe to get its industrial strategy together. If you ask me, what does it mean in our relations with the Global South, I can sympathize with your theory of the three blocks. Now that we have our policy architecture in place for 2030, we're pretty confident that we will achieve the minus 55% target. Everything is in place. It will be a hard job. Don't think that this will be a walk in the park. There's so much implementation work to be done. We need to work on our industrial strategy. But now that we have that policy architecture, we really need to turn radically to the rest of the world. Europe is representing about 7% of global CO2 emissions. So it will not make much of a difference for climate if we succeed in our targets. What we need is the rest of the world. And beyond the Paris Agreement, which is an important lever to get the rest of the world moving, we of course need to use other levers. And I see three levers, and that will correspond to your interpretation of global events today. The first lever we have is that we need to succeed in implementing our Fit for 55 policy. There are many out there that would want us to fail, so that they can say, see, Europe can't do it, no one can do it. So we are condemned to succeed in implementing our established policy architecture now. The second lever is partnerships with the Global South. We need to reach out to countries in the Global South and create win-win partnerships with them for several reasons. One, because it is in Europe's self-interest. Let us be very candid about this. The Global South has massive potential for renewable energy. It has critical raw materials, as you mentioned, that we will need for our green transition. But this partnership must be truly win-win, so that it is also enhancing development and prosperity in the Global South. It's only when it's win-win that it is sustainable. What it means for us, I believe, is that we need to have this secure, trustful partnerships with countries in the Global South, as we're doing with Namibia, for example, today, which is not extractionist, but is really helping these countries to move up the industrial value chain, so that they also develop their clean energy, their clean industry of the future. So rather than us only importing green hydrogen or green ammonia or renewable energy, I think what we will need to do is to help these countries, for example, to produce iron ore, green iron ore, that we then import to Europe and that we concentrate on the higher end of the value chain. This is a departure from what we have traditionally done in our partnerships, but this is really, I think, the way we need to go. But there is one big question mark on this. These must be partnerships in which we have the trust and the security that we can rely on these partnerships for a very, very long time. And that's why they must be truly win-win and not exploiting riches in the South. And the third lever, and I'll conclude on this, is that we need to use our purchasing power, our single market in Europe. We need to increasingly say that we don't want to buy dirty products anymore. We buy clean products. That's where the carbon border adjustment mechanism comes in. That's where the deforestation regulation comes in, which has just been agreed by Parliament and Council. And that's where, very importantly, the whole eco-design program comes in. So that we clearly say to the rest of the world, we are open for trade. We need trade. But trade in increasingly clean products. That is the way Europe wants to work. We are not in the business of local content requirements. We are in the business of sustainability requirements, increasingly more demanding. And we will help the Global South to move up that chain of sustainability. Because, as our High Representative, Mr. Borrell says, we are in a battle not only of narratives, but also a battle of offers to the Global South. We need to make an offer of partnerships that are really, as I said, win-win for them, but also for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. If I may just add on that sort of 2 points. One is that, you know, one of the things that I'm a little bit worried about with the IRA and some of the elements, of course, of the Green Deal as well, is this sort of, you know, protectionism creeping back in to the system. Because, I mean, many of you who are European will know this. The European Union's success has been based on 4 freedoms, on exclusive competence in trade, and on competition policy. So anytime I hear industrial policy or strategic autonomy, I get scared. Because inherently it can be, if I may be very blunt, a French mechanism for basically providing French products. I'm a Francophone myself. I love the country, but if strategic autonomy means, Danone yogurt as well, then I get a little bit worried. Now, the second one is, I think we're going to have in Europe, we're going to have a hell of a lot of convincing to do. Because let's be frank, a lot of European countries have a colonial past. Russia is an imperialist country, but it doesn't have a colonial past in Africa or in Latin America. A lot of times we're perceived as extremely arrogant, as patronizing, and at times aggressive. One of the arguments that I put forward is that I think we need to start, if we want to achieve the green agenda, with which I agree 100%, if we want to have carbon border tax, we're going to have to start to drive a more dignified foreign policy. And that's going to be very difficult for a lot of European countries. And one of the difficult elements in this also is linked to the notion of conditionality. Because there are a lot of countries that can basically say that, listen, when the Cold War ended, China came in here, created dependencies on the economy, yes. Do we have a similar value base? No. Are the deals transactional? Yes. But at least they provide us with hardware. Whether it's infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's bridges, it doesn't matter. They do it. Is it always comfortable for the countries in the global south? No, it's not, but it's very useful. Now, if we come from Europe taking the moral high ground, putting down conditions about cooperation with, countries that don't necessarily follow our values, then I think we're in trouble. And this is the hurdle that we're going to have to get over. And I think this is where the Commission is super well placed. Because I remember from my times in government, especially in foreign policy, every day you had to take a decision between interests and values. Would you do an arms trade with a country which doesn't abide by your ideas of human rights, but they're fighting terrorists? Would you give dual-use goods to countries that, yes, will improve their climate with them, but could use the instruments for something else? So it's going to be a very difficult balance, I think, for Europe to act. And I would argue that China is much more freer to act in this. And I think you will have also found, and you know this because you've sat in countless of international meetings with the global south and countries that do not follow exactly the same rules, procedures, and regulations that we do on climate, that there is this, who are you to come and lecture me about reducing emissions, because your whole industrialization, 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, has basically been based on pollution. So that's why I'm saying that language matters in these things. We can do all the regulation we want. We can do all the finance we want. We can do all the innovation that we want. But if we don't, in a gentle, empathetic, humble way, if we're not able to convince the rest of the world, then we're in this alone. So that's why I wanted to just throw in your direction before you get into the engine room and the nitty-gritty stuff.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hands up for